Thank you very much again for coming today. We're to this webinar about Section 1071 and the final rule that was released in March. Really quickly, this is our agenda today. We're going to go into speaker introductions. We're going to be discussing the purpose of Section 1071 data. What is it? What does the 1071 rule do? The strengths and weaknesses of the final rule. We're going to talk about how you can use 1071 data when it starts to come to the public. Some items that are still open, and then attempts to repeal, and then we'll close with a support sign-on letter and some Q&A. We should have about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So to dive right in, I will introduce myself first. I am Kevin Hill. I am the Senior Policy Advisor here at NCRC. I moved over to the policy team this year. Some of you may know me from my role in the organizing team, which I was in for the last couple of years. So now I'm going to turn to my great co-presenters today. First, Beverly.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for inviting me to join the webinar today. My name is Beverly Brown-Ruggia. I'm the Financial Justice Program Director for New Jersey Citizen Action. We are a member of NCRC and have worked with organizations across the country like CRC in our CRA work and our advocacy for small business. And I also happen to be the chair of the Community Advisory Board for the CFPB, although I am not representing the CAB here today. But in that capacity, I see a lot that goes on in terms of small business lending. Kevin?
Thanks, Beverly, and hi to everyone. My name is Kevin Stein. I'm the Chief of Legal and Strategy at the California Reinvestment Coalition. We're a statewide advocacy group. I'm also a member of the NCRC Board of Directors, and also want to thank NCRC for hosting us and for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for joining and participating.
Great. Kevin, you want to take it away on the purpose of Section 1071?
Yes. So for the next hour or so, we are going to get into a fair amount of detail and specifics relating to the rule. And for some of you, it will be maybe more than you wanted. And for, I'm sure, others, it will be less than you wanted. But I definitely wanted to start us off by acknowledging the gravity of this moment, and to say that, and I think many of you, hopefully all of you, will recognize this is a big win for small businesses in underserved communities. So we just wanted to note that. That's one thing you should take away from all this, and to thank everyone out there for all of your work to make it so. There were a lot of people for over a long period of time that got us to this day. All right, so Section 1071, I think, as most people know, it's part of the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010. There are two important purposes that Congress identified for the rule. Number one, to facilitate the enforcement of fair lending laws. And number two, to enable communities, government entities, and creditors to identify business and community development needs and opportunities of women-owned, minority-owned, and small businesses. So why do we care? Why do we think this is so important? Well, we know that discrimination persists in small business lending and small farm lending. The transparency that will be provided by the data under the rule will bring help to regulators, advocacy groups, and lenders to help them identify and address discriminatory lending outcomes. And this is similar to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which I think many of us are maybe more familiar with, where we believe the mere fact of transparency and just the knowledge that the information about lending will be made publicly available is going to lead to better lending outcomes, more fair lending. And where there are instances of where there are outliers and there's evidence of discrimination, with this data as a society, we will be in a better position to address that through enforcement and policy. Getting to this point has been a struggle and has been a long effort. The California Reinvestment Coalition was really pleased to play our part a few years ago in joining with Democracy Forward and NowCab and a couple of small business owners who were part of the Main Street Alliance in suing the CFPB for failing to develop the rule. And we were really so happy not too long ago, was it a couple of months ago, to be at the NCRC conference and to hear Director Chopra unveil the new rule. And I was particularly happy to be sitting next to Beverly at that moment, and my boss, Paulina Gonzalez Brito. A good moment. And of course, it felt good because the rulemaking, the road to the rulemaking certainly led before that day and before the lawsuit and even before the Dodd-Frank Act. And I wanted, if I could, with your indulgence, to acknowledge a couple of people, a couple of California leaders who I think a lot about when I think about 1071 and this long road. The first two people I think of, number one is Alan Fisher, who was the founding director of the California Reinvestment Coalition and led our small business lending advocacy efforts over many years, and who retired at the very end of 2013. And his last act as a CRC director was to hit the send button on his final small business lending report, The Little Engine That Could. As a number of people know, Alan passed away about 1.5 years ago. The other person I'm thinking a lot about now is Clarence Williams, who was the longtime director of California Capital Financial Development Corporation, CDFI, in the greater Sacramento area, serving small businesses for many years. He was on CRC's board of directors for many years. He was the very first person I heard talking about this data and how disadvantaged small businesses were and the small business community was by not having information that, looking across the aisle, so to speak, we could see in the mortgage context, in the housing context, the groups serving those communities did have, and how having that data would make such a difference and was really necessary. He was a strong advocate for this for many years, as I say, like the person I think of when I think about this rule, along with Alan. And I'm very sad to report that Clarence passed away about a week ago. So it is very sad to think about the two of them, but good to think about them in this context where they both were pleased to hear how the rule has been developing over time. And I am hopeful that we will be able to honor their legacies and the legacies of others like them who worked for this rulemaking, and to do so really by fighting to defend the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Section 1071 rule, which are both under strong attack, as we'll talk about a bit later, and to use the data when it comes out to advance the interests of small businesses and increase access to credit. And with that, I will turn it back to Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. So now we're going to turn to, what does the 1071 rule do? It is designed to really shine a light on blind spots in small business lending. And it requires small business lenders that originate at least 100 loans to small businesses or small farms in each of the last 2 years, more on that soon, to start annually reporting on their small business lending by race, ethnicity, sex/gender, and sexual orientation. And it defines a small business as one with gross revenue of $5 million or less, and it excludes nonprofits. So that's the number of loans. It would be at least 100 loans in the previous 2 years to businesses that are making $5 million or less. It requires the race, ethnicity, sex/gender, and sexual orientation collected for principal business owners, which are defined by the rule as individuals with 25% or more of the equity interest in a business. So by that definition, a business can have a maximum of 4 principal owners because by definition, they have 25% control. It defines a business as owned by a person of color, women, or member of the LGBTQI+ community if 2 conditions. More than 50% of ownership or control is held by one or more members of that community, and more than 50% of the net profit or loss accrues to one or more members of that community. Here is the implementation schedule. And for people who are wondering, this is kind of a quick, this is what's in the rule. And then we're gonna, the next section, we're gonna spend more detail on, what are the real strengths here and what are some things that might need to be improved down the line. But here's the implementation schedule. It's a tiered implementation schedule, as you can see. The largest lenders are sort of up first. The lenders that originate at least 2,500 small business loans must start collecting data starting October 1st, 2024. Lenders, the middle tier is the people that are originating at least 500 loans. They have to start April 1st, 2025. And then finally, the smallest lenders that are covered by this rule, lenders that originate at least 100 loans in the previous 2 years, must start collecting data January 1st, 2026. As Kevin touched on, and I'll allude to a little bit more, this is really likely to lead to increases in small business lending. Remember the saying, what gets measured gets done. This really will, get data, small business lending data, into the 21st century. And really, the Director Chopra said it when he announced it. This really just the change of requiring the lenders to report out, really will shift attitudes. Lenders want to look good on these types of reports. It also, will really show lenders how they're stacking up compared to peers when they're lending to underserved businesses, and show them if they're, falling behind and need to do something. And of course, then, NCRC and our members and other advocates will have the ability to use this data to really raise issues when needed, but also just be able to, put things into better context and really see, how a small business lending of a lender is playing out. And, HMDA data, as it was improved and got more specific on race and things like that, led to significant increases for Black and Latinx borrowers. And so we are anticipating that this will also similarly lead to increases for Black, Latinx, Asian, women-owned, and LGBTQI plus businesses as well. Furthermore, the last point I'll say for now, in 2020, Citibank did a study that found that fair access to lending for Black businesses alone would have created $650 billion in additional business revenue per year and 6.1 million new jobs. So, this, 1071 data should be able to clear out and as a tool for detecting and facilitating enforcement of fair lending laws. So it should greatly help at addressing, evidence of discrimination that we have found. And that's why Citibank, prepared this report that suggests that if there was just fair access to lending, we would see all these positive economic benefits that really will bring widespread benefits to the economy. So now we're going to turn more to, that was sort of the high level, what does 1071 do? Now we want to turn to a little more in depth. And the way we've organized this is we're going to start with sort of the strengths, and then we're going to start with some areas that might need to be improved. But now I'm going to turn it over to Beverly.
Thanks, Kevin. So what we know is that 1071 has very good coverage in terms of the types of small business and small farm lenders. The range it covers almost all types of lenders. We're going to touch a little bit on some of there's some qualifications there that have to do with some thresholds, but we'll get to that later. Overall, the coverage, the types of lenders are pretty complete. And there's some, I think you all have these slides, but the details here, banks, credit unions, platform lenders, CDFIs, et cetera. So it covers a broad, the full range of lenders. We also see that 1071 has good coverage of the types of loans. And we also are going to be looking at some pretty detailed data points that as those of you who work in CRA know that the more granular the data, the more accurate the analysis we can make in terms of, what types of products there are, who's getting them, et cetera. So the data points are good. They're broad. There's a lot of them. And also, the CFPB was allowed to, there's some data points that were required in statute. But 1071 also gives some, the CFPB has actually put in some discretionary data points. And that is, they are additional data points, again, more granular and help us see more clearly what's actually going on. So I'm going to turn to Kevin now, who's going to go a little bit into those data points.
Yeah, and just, I know we're trying to move through quickly, but just in terms of the previous slide and the kinds of products that are covered, just to flag a couple that we were particularly pleased to see included. Oh, thank you for going back. So one is credit cards. You know, a number of our members, and I think CRC members and maybe NCRC members, have really been concerned that, you know, it seems like some neighborhoods are getting a lot more credit card loans than term loans. So now, but that's been hard because of this larger problem of the lack of data. It's been hard to confirm that, except in certain kind of exceptional circumstances. Now we'll have that data and we can make of it what we will. And also merchant cash advance. So this is a very big issue for a lot of our members, including CDFIs, who find themselves having to kind of, you know, use up their precious capital to refinance people who got really taken advantage of. In many cases, it's through high cost lenders that may include merchant cash advance. Very little data on that. There was a push to exempt merchant cash advance there, so they're included, and we'll look forward to really being able to understand that market better. And then just moving on. So as Kevin and Beverly mentioned, a number of the data points were in the statute. So Congress essentially said, CFPB, this must be in the rule. And so this is a list of those items. Some of them will seem familiar for those who look at HMDA, like action taken. Type and purpose of loan. Credit includes things like whether the loan was secured or unsecured, and whether there are guarantees and what kinds of guarantees. So there's a lot of really helpful information that we'll be able to see once the data comes out. And I think we can maybe move on to the next slide. And as noted, the CFPB, Congress gave CFPB the authority to add some discretional points to really effectuate the purpose of the rule, right? So to make it so that we can really help with enforcement around fair lending and understand community credit needs, the CFPB added these additional data points, and I will talk about just a couple, right? So we don't want to go through all of them, and maybe I'll focus on the first and the last, and then Beverly, maybe you can pick one or two of interest. The pricing information, so that is huge. Some of you may be old enough to remember that we had a subprime mortgage crisis not too long ago, and it was easy to see that a lot of loans were being made to certain borrowers and in certain neighborhoods, but we really did not have information at that time about the cost of those loans. Are these good loans or are these bad loans? So without the pricing information, the data would really have been, I think, compromised in our view, would have been much less helpful. So this is a big deal. We'll have information not only about whether loans were extended and originated, but also the pricing experienced by the small business owners. And then lastly, the last thing I'll mention here is we were glad to see the CFPB include sexual orientation as part of this data collection effort, so that we can understand better the market in that regard. We do believe that there is discrimination, significant discrimination against the LGBTQI+ community, and so this will help us understand that better.
Kevin, I'll just pick one for now, but I'm very happy that denial reasons are included for a couple of, you know, when we talk to banks, sometimes when we see why somebody's been denied a loan, we can go back to the bank and ask them to take a second look. That's something that we do quite frequently. And so if we understand, you know, what the reason was, we can ask for that. It also helps us as an organization that works with small business owners, help them prepare so that they're in better shape when they make their applications. But denial reasons is something that's really important to know in terms of what banks are doing, but also what we need to help entrepreneurs know before they even apply for the loans.
Great. And I think we can go to the next slide. So the next couple of slides are regarding the disaggregated race and ethnic data categories. And in some ways, this is not anything new. And so maybe it's like, well, if we have this in the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, it's exactly the same as what we have now in the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. But in a way, it is another big victory. HMDA not too long ago did not ask for this level of disaggregation, this level of detail regarding borrowers. And I know a number of CRC members over the years. I will go back to 2010 when the Fed had authority over HMDA and was conducting community meetings around like what should HMDA be if HMDA is lagging the market. We're having less information that's publicly available to really understand what's happening today. We had members in particular representing the Asian Pacific Islander community saying the broad Asian race category was having the effect of masking discrimination that was occurring within the Asian American community. And we and others, NCRC, Capacity, maybe UNIDOS as well, a lot of groups really fought to get to this point of disaggregated data, which we think is really important. And I know NCRC is reporting that borrowers are getting more and more comfortable reporting this data. So we have a fuller picture of what's happening in the market, and really glad to see that has been applied to the 1071 small business context. And people can see the disaggregated categories. Maybe it's not necessary to kind of go through them.
Great. So now we're going to move into a section where, we're going to discuss some areas where we do think the 1071 rule might need to be improved. Before we get into this section, though, it is helpful to remind people that, despite, there are some, some serious concerns, but the final 1071 rule still greatly expands our knowledge of the small business lending landscape. And these are areas that just, going forward, as the CFPB starts collecting this data and then eventually releasing it to the public, there's just some aspects that we think are going to have to probably get cleaned up. And that's similar again to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which has been consistently approved, getting the disaggregated racial data that Kevin Stein was just talking about. So we just think that these are areas that are the first areas that are most likely going to need to be improved as this data moves forward. The first is the 100 loan threshold. There's a good chance that the CFPB will determine that this needs to be lowered to increase coverage of banks in particular, and also in coverage in general. Originally the CFPB proposed a 25 loan threshold that would have covered around 75% of banks. The 100 loan threshold is estimated to cover about 36% of banks, which clearly shows a large amount of banks then are not covered at the 100 loan threshold. That does create some complications within using 1071 data, because if there's fewer peers right around that 100 loan threshold, it makes it harder to make comparisons and to really use the data to put a specific lender's lending into context. We know there's going to be a fair amount above the 2500 level and the 500 level, but if there's very few that are right around that 100 level, it's just harder to make comparisons. And that has a kind of larger impact on like smaller cities, rural areas, because that's where smaller lenders tend to be headquartered. And so that could be that it's highly likely that CFPB, after they start collecting data, and after NCRC and our members start analyzing this data, that's something that they will need to revisit. It also potentially makes it complicated. We all are awaiting the final CRA rule, which we expect to come out sometime this year. And the regulators did propose in the NPR for the CRA rule that 1071 data would sort of replace CRA small business data, since it's much better, and to not make have two different small business data requirements out there. But at the 100 loan threshold, there could be large banks that aren't at that 100 loan threshold. And so then it creates a complication of like, are we going to have split reporting systems based on if you're now 1071 and then CRA still applies? So it makes things a little more complicated in ways that the initially proposed 25 loan threshold wouldn't have, because it would have covered, more of the involved actors. Also, another change from the initial proposal to the final rule is the final rule does not require lenders to complete demographic information when it was not provided by the applicant, as rules for mortgage lending do, and as first proposed by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This could result in significant amounts of missing demographic data. We've seen instances like, for instance, the PPP program. In the PPP program, it was optional for applicants to submit their demographic data, and 25% of only 25% of PPP applications included that data because it was optional. So that really, we clearly, we can't have anywhere near 75% of 1071 data missing demographic data. And it gets to, this really kind of gets almost to like a paradox. At least some of those people that are choosing not to provide their race, their gender, and business loan applications, it's safe to assume at least some of them are not doing so because they're worried if they do so, their application will be viewed less favorably. Basically, they're worried they're going to be discriminated against. But the paradox here is that without having this information, it's much harder to address and identify and root out that discrimination. So that's why, the rule requires, notices being provided, and there's firewalls as well. But we really think the CFPB may need to reconsider this proposal because mortgage lending already works this way. If it's not provided, they rely on a visual observation or surname, and we know that's not perfect, but there's ways there's ways the data could be set up to highlight, this is instances where that was used. And we think this is something that may need to be reconsidered. Also, the free-form submission of sex/gender instead of set categories. Free-form, I'm sure the CFPB is thinking about ways on the back end. Free-form, so everyone is clear, is instead of a set number of categories, you have a form that you would either write in paper or write online, your sex/gender. That was initially they were proposing to do set categories and giving up people the options to not provide or the option to self-describe. We looked at this and we looked at recommendations from some experts that really looked at issues of gender identity and gender expression, and we would really think that this should be looked at again. We would suggest better categories because it's just better for data. There's much less, variation, typos, and I'm sure the CFPB is thinking of ways to address it on the back end, but it's not. You could have made it almost a little easier on yourselves by coming up with set categories, and it's important in those set categories that we have space for transgender-owned businesses to indicate, their businesses. There's pervasive evidence of discrimination towards transgender individuals, and it's great that CFPB added sexual orientation, but by creating a sort of transgender gender category, we would have a better sense of how businesses owned by transgender individuals are being served, which would be very valuable. Other things, some other things that didn't quite make it in that would have been good include they chose not to include factoring. There also is some data points we would have liked to see. Credit scores. The credit scores are not one of the data points that are being collected. Middle Eastern and North African continue to not be to not be allowed as an option. They're also currently not in the census. They're not in HMDA. We think the Bureau largely kind of deferred a bit on this one, but we would have liked to see a Middle Eastern and North African category, as well as also the Bureau decided not to add a category as well for businesses owned by people with disabilities, which is something that NCRC and many others suggested they do. Now I'm going to turn back to Beverly, who's going to talk a bit more about how to use 1071 data.
Thanks, Kevin. So now we have all this rich information, and we are going to spend the next few years figuring out how we're going to use it. But there are some ways that fit in with our traditional CRA work. Obviously, comparing the performance of lenders, looking at peers, looking at the numbers in a community that reflect what different banks are doing is going to be important. So the comparison is critically important. We're looking at applications, the originations, what neighborhoods they're in, their denials based on race, et cetera. And then making comparisons across different business sectors, et cetera. And we also want to look for, as we start getting into collecting the data, lenders who are missing demographic data. Are they doing enough outreach to the communities where they do business? How are they presenting the application or the information on the applications that will give us the data that's called for in 1071? And one thing that's really great is that we at Citizen Action rely on NCRC for a lot of the data analysis, because there is going to be a lot of information. And so they have some tools that are really quite helpful to organizations like mine, advocates, and even members of the public to look at the data and understand it. They'll put it together and analyze it in a way that you can digest it more easily. I also just wanted to talk more generally about uses as a CRA advocate. And the way we see this information being used in our industry. So first of all, we know that this information gives regulators in what they need to do to hold lenders more accountable for their obligations to lend in the communities where they do business. They're going to have more granular information when they're rating bank, when they're doing CRA rating. They're going to have the information they need to make better decisions about mergers. And then we as advocates will be able to sit down with the banks that we work with and point to very specific issues with the way that they're reaching out to or working with the communities that we support or we advocate for. So it's a tool that we can use when we're working with banks to help them improve their performance. And as with HMDA, the more specific the information, the more specific we can get about looking at how they're marketing, how, do they have representatives in the bank that reflect the community that's applying for these loans, the people that are actually looking for the loans. So that's a tremendous tool in working with the banks. It also allows us to weigh in positively or negatively on merger applications. As advocates, we look at the way banks have performed, and if they want to get bigger, it's our view that they need to be better. And so they need to start out with a good, strong record. If they don't have one, we're happy to work with them to help them improve that record. And this kind of granular information on small business lending will enable us to do that much better. We have the HMDA, but combined with the small business data that's been talked about today, we're going to have much more accurate and productive participation in the comments that go to regulators when it comes to merger applications. And also I want to say that, we also work with small business entrepreneurs, helping them understand, why they're not getting loans, help them also become activists for their communities and talk about the fact that their communities are not being lent to equitably and fairly. And that information is something that's important to the public. We also finally think that this is incredibly important information for the banks. I mean, when we sit down with the banks, we assume that they want to be lending to everyone in the communities where they do business and they make money. We assume that they want to do that fairly and thoroughly. And so it gives them the opportunity to identify untapped markets. Maybe they just don't understand where they are. It helps them understand the demand for and the type of products that different communities need, and entrepreneurs in different communities, entrepreneurs that come from different populations. So those are ways that I see the data becoming very specifically helpful in the work that we do to make sure that fair lending is carried out properly and that CRA obligations are met.
Thanks, Beverly. Turning back to Kevin Stein.
Thanks to you both. So there were a lot of questions answered by the rule, but not all questions were answered. And one really big one is regarding which of these data points is going to be made available to the public. So if 1071 is a transparency statute, we're all going to use the transparency for, for the greater good. We need to have the transparency. We need to be able to see the data. What is the CFPB concerned about? They're concerned that the data will be so detailed that particular businesses can be identified. They can be re-identified. And that would be a really bad outcome. And we're concerned about that to the extent that that could happen. But we also, we have the experience, but like with a lot of this, where we can look to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, where there's a lot of data. And for many years, lenders have argued about, well, we were concerned about privacy and we're worried that that privacy is going to be violated and there'll be re-identification risk. And Josh Silver of NCRC fame has often noted that in all the years where these privacy concerns have been raised, that we're not aware of any instance where HMDA data was used to re-identify a borrower. And we think similarly, the concerns, it's an important concern, but we think it can be dealt with through modifying the data and how it's presented to the public. And we're really looking forward to as much of the data being made available to the public as possible. Why? Because that's the purpose. Congress said, we want to have this rule and this data available so that we can effectively enforce fair lending. That will be compromised if we don't have access to all the data. And so that the public can see and lenders can see and local governments can see where are their community needs that are not being met, where are there opportunities and gaps. And if we don't have the data, we can't do that. So hopefully there'll be a good resolution, and probably I think the CFPB has indicated it's not sure how, in what form it will come back to the public with this proposal. And but probably though, I assume there'll be an opportunity for us all to engage. And so we should be prepared to do that at the appropriate time. And then there's one other issue we wanted to flag. The CFPB somewhat curiously notes that there may be a process for smaller lenders that have, quote, demonstrated high levels of success in serving their local communities as measured by the CRA and any similar state laws, that maybe they would get more time to comply. And I think our feeling, maybe our collective feeling at this point is we're not so sure about that one. There does seem to be a fair amount of time to comply, and we don't know exactly what that phrase that's in quotes means. And regardless, it does seem like we're talking about two different things. CRA, important, we all love CRA. It's been, the focus has been on LMI, low and moderate income communities and borrowers. And 1071 is really about the race, ethnicity, sexual orientation status of the owners. So it seems that maybe groups will be commenting on this idea, maybe opposing this idea.
Thanks, Kevin. We're now on the final stretch before we go into Q&A. I did want to close though by discussing some of the attempts to repeal 1071. House Republicans have introduced HJ Res 50 that would repeal 1071, and a lawsuit has been filed by the Texas Bankers Association and Rio Bank. Before we get into this, I do just want to say we do not anticipate that HJ Res 50 will succeed. It's also, increasingly hard to predict the courts these days, but we also think the chances are good that the lawsuit filed by the Texas Bankers Association will not succeed. However, we do need to be vigilant about these sorts of attempts to take back this progress and this, moving forward with, getting small business lending data into the 21st century. And so we just want to take a little bit of time to go through sort of the three main arguments. These are definitely the three main arguments of the lawsuit. And you might hear some critiques of 1071 along these lines. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time walking through these. The first, argument you'll hear a lot is the CFPB's funding structure is unconstitutional. Then you'll hear the CFPB dramatically and irresponsibly increase the number of data points. We'll get into it, but not true. And then also that cost to lenders will be high, particularly for smaller lenders. We also don't anticipate that to be true. So starting in order, the Supreme Court will ultimately decide on the funding structure of the CFPB. But we are hopeful that the court will find that the court structure is constitutional, just as the Second Circuit Court has, and as there was an amicus brief this week with 144 current and former members of Congress, where they're all saying that the CFPB's funding structure is clearly constitutional. And they're saying this because many public agencies are funded outside the annual appropriations process, as the CFPB is. The CFPB, receives its funding from the Federal Reserve, and it is capped on how much it can receive from the Federal Reserve, without going through another process. That's capped at 12%. These other agencies that have similar funding structures include the other federal financial regulators, Federal Reserve, OCC, FDIC, that are responsible for administering the CRA. So people are familiar with CRA, are very familiar with those regulators. Their funding structure is very, very similar. They're not part of the annual appropriations process either. There's also many state financial regulators that have similar processes. And the reason is for this is because Congress has consistently assigned significant responsibility over consumer laws to agencies outside the annual appropriations process in order to ensure budgetary stability. As you can see, these are agencies that are working on very complex and long-term regulatory initiatives, such as Section 1071. With the it is hard to predict the Supreme Court these days, as we all know, but if the Supreme Court would, largely decide that CFPB's funding structure is unconstitutional, it would really call into question a lot of other agencies. And I don't think anyone wants that degree of uncertainty, because the laws would still be on the books. Dodd-Frank would still be on the books. It's just the steps that the regulators have taken to interpret and implement those laws would now be called into question. That's a high amount of uncertainty that would create. And so we're very hopeful that the CFPB will be able to withstand that kind of attack, and because it is, a widely used funding structure. Moving on to the other point, the point that, the CFPB just, started adding all these data points. The lawsuit mentions multiple times that the CFPB went from 13 to 81 data points. Where did they get that 81 figure? They got it from a chart that the CFPB put out, linked right there. The final, as we mentioned earlier, the final rule really only requires 20 main data points, but some of these are a little complicated and have multiple subcomponents. And that chart that CFPB did was the CFPB's thorough job of trying to show to lenders, like, here's all the different data points. But in practice, though, a lot of these aren't, it's not like each of these points is going to cause a significant amount of additional cost. For example, collecting race and ethnicity, everyone agrees it has to do that. That was part of the 1071. That was not added by the CFPB. There's 37 different data points of that 81 are just on the race and ethnicity, because it's disaggregated. There's a lot of different things in play there. So that is 45% of those 81 data points that get mentioned frequently in the lawsuit. Of the 81 data points, we've gone and looked at them. We would argue that 57 or 70% were required, and only 24 or 30% were added by the CFPB's discretionary authority. Furthermore, we would say that 14 of those 24 data points added by the CFPB were for pricing information. As we discussed earlier, that is critical information for assessing how business needs are being met and detecting for possible lending issues. So we absolutely needed those data points, and it was reasonable of the CFPB to add them. Finally, costs. When you read the, if anyone does but want to read the Texas bankers complaint, it's about a 20-page complaint. So meaning not very long in terms of how these things usually are. You'll find a lot of discussion about costs, and sometimes you'll see some other critiques of 1071 is it's too expensive. A lot of time, almost every time you're going to hear someone talk about costs, you're not going to hear them talk about the income that lenders generate from making loans, which, remember, that's why they do it. Lenders, make loans to generate money. And the CFPB created estimates of cost and income for loans for 3 categories of depository lenders based on the numbers of loans they originate. Some people have criticized the cost estimates that CFPB came up with, but the CFPB did double the cost estimates, the hiring, the training, they doubled the training hours, and they also increased the cost estimates by assuming that, businesses may have to hire a full-time employee. So the CFPB did, in response to industry feedback, increase their cost estimates. They did not, though, increase the income estimates because no one challenged them. There hasn't been any challenge to the net income estimates the CFPB put out in the notice of proposed rulemaking and again in the final rule. And if you go and you take, and they came up with those estimates for 3 different categories of banks, based on how many loans they originate. And if you go and you take the minimum ranges, because they present it as a range, the minimum ranges of net income per of the origination, and you apply that, per the number of loans that they would make to be in those categories, you basically get that this comes out to 0.1 to 0.9% of annual income from originations of small business loans. That is 0.1 to 0.9% is a small cost to pay to get small business lending data into the 20th century. And also after the one-time cost, these estimated costs drops to just 0.006 to 0.4%. Here's some charts that get at this. We'll be sending all this out, so don't feel you have to screenshot yet or take copious notes. The lawsuit did also say that, we don't agree with these costs. We think the costs are going to be much higher, $100,000. All right, even $100,000, we're talking about 0.75% of the net income of in 1 year from originating small business loans. So the cost argument here does not really make sense when you think about the entire picture and you think about how much income the banks generate from lenders generate from making these loans. I thought I had a slide here. I'm not sure what happened to it. We were going to the last thing I'll say before we move into Q&A. We are going to be sending out a 1071 support sign-on letter. We want to send this letter to the House Financial Services Committee before they start the markup of HJ Res 50, which is one of those it's a legislation that was introduced to repeal 1071. Again, we want you to sign on to this and show your support. We don't anticipate that HJ Res 50 will be successful, but we do want to show, strong community showing and show, our allies in Congress that they are on firm ground to say that, the community needs this data and the community wants this data. My colleague Joe Reed will be sending out the sign-on letter shortly after this, after the conclusion of this webinar. Please review the letter. It's short. I think it's only like 4 or 5 pages. That's short. But please review it, sign on, and please do that as soon as you can, because we want to send this, before they do markup, which could be as soon as next week or the week after. So please do sign on to that. It's very important because we want to show support for 1071, and also consider reaching out to your local congressional office as well to discuss the importance of 1071 data. And feel free to contact me if you wanted more information on doing that. All right. That was a lot. We have about 9 minutes left. I'm going to start taking some questions. Let me just quickly look at some. Again, you can submit questions in the Q&A tool. How can, all right, sorry if I mispronounced some names. Pooja Mehta, the Marigold Effect asked, how can small business advisors who work with underrepresented founders best use this information to advocate for more equity in lending now? Beverly, that you covered that a bit. Do you want to take that question?
Sure. I mean, now is a bit of a question mark because it's going to take a while for us to get the data through 1071. But I know that, you know, in the work that we do, what we can start doing is working with communities where there's a need for more equitable lending in small business, and find out what their needs are. Talk to people about the fact that they're going to be asked different questions when they apply for loans, so that people understand why those questions are being asked. That's something that there is some concern about, how people are going to react to the questions. So I think educating the community about 1071 and its purpose and what's in it, and what the banks are going to start asking people in terms of all the data points that we went over. So that's important. But also in terms of working with the banks to make sure that they understand how to reach out to the communities, you know, where they should be lending, to find out what the needs are, but also to help communicate to potential small business owners what 1071 is about, and that they will be asking new questions.
Thanks, Beverly. Kevin, anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, and this is a broader message. Like for now, it's defending the rule and defending the CFPB. And I know NCRC members are going to do it. To the extent there are people on the call, maybe, I don't know if the questioner is an NCRC member. I know there are financial institutions on the call. There were a lot of institutions and organizations that have made recent commitments to racial justice and express concern about closing the racial wealth gap and gender wealth gaps and related wealth gaps. Well, this is it. This is 1071 is a major way to work towards that. And it is really important for everyone to kind of, as these attacks persist, and, you know, hopefully Kevin's right, like we'll come out on top. But we need to be vigilant about it. And especially those who are kind of on the industry side of things, it is important for you and your organizations and your trade associations to not oppose and to ideally support the CFPB's constitutionality and its existence and this rulemaking. And I will just say, we're really disappointed to see at times that is not happening. So that is the thing to do in the short term.
Yeah, Kevin, can I just add that, you know, recently, I think just the other day, the Senate submitted an amicus brief in support of the CFPB. And that was one of the things that we did on the ground in New Jersey, was to advocate to make sure that our senators were actively were signed on to that amicus brief. And I believe there will be more opportunities like that. So thank you, Kevin, for bringing that up, because you can reach out to leadership and publicly speak out about the importance of protecting the CFPB.
Thank you. Question from Lacey Lent. What is happening with small farms? Is 1071 including them? Yes, they are. And in fact, one of the data points added by the CFPB was NAICS code. And so that can be used to identify if it's like an agricultural business or not. Sorry again if I mispronounce. Oesta Sarkash from the Small Business Majority. Can you expand on the factoring rule? Kevin, I know you're particularly interested in this. Do you want to field this one?
I will try, and shout out to the Small Business Majority, which does great work and has really supported all these efforts very strongly, and other efforts. So factoring didn't make it in. And I know maybe Small Business Majority, I know a few of our members really wanted to see factoring included. And I think the CFPB determined they could not include it because it did not meet their definition of a loan. And I may have that wrong. one thing that I saw a few of the comments were raising similar concerns about data points of particular interest that weren't included in the final rule, that we didn't get, that were kind of a loss from a small business consumer advocacy standpoint. The CFPB rule is really long, in part because it includes the CFPB's discussion of its decision. So there is a discussion on factoring, what was proposed, all the comments that were received, and the CFPB's thinking. So it's a lot of pages, and I'm not sure if I'm remembering exactly, but I think on factoring, the CFPB determined that it really did not fit the definition of a loan. And again, I might be mistaken there, but people can look and find these discussions in the rule. And I guess I'd note that, CFPB did seem to approach this very thoughtfully. We didn't get everything we wanted. There are a lot of big disappointments, but it did consider all the comments, and there is this discussion. And I think they really gave it, the serious thought that it required.
Thank you, Kevin. Victoria Stein had a question. Concerns about 100 loan threshold via VCRA was confusing. Are there a lot of large banks that would be excluded at this level of lending? Perhaps I misunderstood you. So let me clear that up, Victoria. Sorry, that was a little unclear. And part of the reason it's unclear is because it is hard to exactly evaluate how it's going to play out. Because we are thinking of ways that we could kind of better anticipate which lenders would be likely to cover at the 100 loan threshold and which ones aren't. It's very easy to find the large, the banks that are doing well more than 100. It's easy to tell, but it is kind of harder to determine right now exactly which specific smaller lenders will be covered and which ones won't. And that's because partly so it's the the data we have now on small business lending from CRA will tell us, these are loans that were $1 million or less, and went to either a business that was making $1 million or less in revenue, or a business that was in a low to moderate income census tract. And that's it, really. That's really the vast majority of CRA small business data now. Remember the 100 loan threshold, their definition of a small business is businesses that make $5 million and up. So we could put together some stuff based on the 1 million threshold, but that's intentionally, or that would be excluding a lot of stuff, because the 1071 rule defines a small business as higher. It goes up to 5 million, and we currently don't have CRA data on that. So there is a question here about how many large banks, which are roughly banks that are at 1.4 billion. It's a little less than that, but it gets adjusted for inflation. But it's basically, currently large banks that are around 1.4 billion and up in assets, they have to do the CRA business data of the 1 million or less, or the local census tracts. It's hard to really determine exactly how many of those banks may not have to follow 1071 because they're doing 100 loans or less on small business. It's kind of the different definitions here are we're not exactly sure how it's going to play out because of the data issues. And I think this really just gets at, this is why we need better data, because it's affecting our ability to set up strong programs and things like that. But the big takeaway still is 100 loan threshold may need to get revised, but we're still going to have a much better sense of small business lending data going forward than we have now. And HMDA, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act we have today was not the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act as it was passed. So there is opportunities, as data comes out and as these examples become more telling and clear, for us to make adjustments through advocacy and all that good stuff. Kevin or Beverly, we should actually we are at time. I want to be mindful of all of your schedules. I guess that would basically be my closing statements. Beverly or Kevin, do you want to take a minute each to do a closing statement?
Sure, I'll let Kevin wrap up in the end, but I'll just say that, the symptoms of what happens when you don't have fair and equitable small business lending are clear. We see whole communities and cities that that have insufficient or no Main Street small business corridors at all. We see whole populations denied the benefit of financial stability and generational wealth building that comes from small business ownership. We see entire cities and towns and counties that can't meet the service needs for their citizens because they don't have the tax revenues that come from small businesses. 1071 will allow us to go deeper, go underneath these symptoms with the data that we're going to have to diagnose the real causes of the symptoms I just described. And we hope that it will help us attack and end discrimination and redlining in small business lending. And we hope that it'll create a truly more equitable and fair small business lending culture and environment. But we need to work the data, we'll get it. And it's going to take all of us to make 1071 the significant and historic advance that it should be in the world of small business lending. And I'll just leave it there.
And I will agree with all that. We didn't even manage to talk about how businesses are struggling today and over the last few years with the pandemic. I think everybody's, rather aware and conscious of the disparities in terms of who was impacted by the pandemic, how small businesses were impacted, the workers who were impacted. As in a lot of our work, the disproportionalities are painfully clear. 1071 is a solution. It's not a perfect solution. Let's fight for it in the short term. Let's use it when the data comes out. All of this takes a long time, many years for HMDA, many years for 1071. Get engaged with NCRC, get engaged with any local advocacy organizations on this issue and more broadly for the benefit of small businesses, residents, institutions, and our local communities. And thanks again to NCRC for kind of pulling us all together on this and for really pushing forward the 1071 rule.
Yeah, I just like to say thank you. I would like particularly to say thank you to NCRC and CRC for the incredible work that you did to get 1071 finally out. And yeah, so just want to thank you and all the advocates who worked on it, and let's fight to save the CFPB.
Thank you very much, Beverly and Kevin, and thank you all. Lots of good questions that we couldn't quite get to. Feel free to email me, and if we want to talk more about this, khill@ncrc.org. Please be on the lookout for our support 1071 sign-on letter be coming from my colleague Joe Reed. I'm sure many of you know him, but please sign on to that letter because we want to send it to the House Financial Services Committee before they start markup of the HJ Res 50. But thanks again. I believe there's a survey link in the chat to weigh in on how we did here today. Really appreciate all the people that came here, and look forward to continuing to work with you. So thanks again, everybody. And with that, have a good rest of your day.